The United Kingdom today expelled 23 Russian diplomats in retaliation for failing to explain the poisoning attempt of a former spy on British soil. Now, Britain gave the diplomats a week to leave the embassy. It also severed high-level bilateral contacts and threatened more actions. This move effectively plunges UK-Russian relations into a deep freeze not seen since the Cold War. And when Moscow missed the deadline to explain how the chemical got to England, Prime Minister Theresa May declared Russia responsible for the attempted murder.
Their response has demonstrated complete disdain for the gravity of these events. They have provided no credible explanation that could suggest they lost control of their nerve agent. No explanation as to how this agent came to be used in the United Kingdom. No explanation as to why Russia has an undeclared chemical weapons program in contravention of international law. Instead, they have treated the use of a military-grade nerve agent in Europe with sarcasm, contempt and defiance.
The Russian embassy in London is calling the expulsion of diplomats, quote, totally unacceptable, unjustified, and short-sighted. Now, in an emergency session of the UN Security Council, U.S. ambassador said that the Trump administration stands in, quote, absolute solidarity with Great Britain, believing Russia was, in fact, behind the attack. Walter Zaryckyj is executive director of the Center for U.S.-Ukrainian Relations. Welcome. So, 23 people were expelled. Is that enough?
Actually, in some ways, it's a reasonable first step, but I'm not quite sure it's enough, given the fact that the track record that Britain's had, and there was a very good article written by Chatham House very recently about this. Britain has been lax in terms of responses to 14 suspected murders of old Russian nationals or expats in Britain. It's been kind of irresponsible in terms of its of the Budapest Protocol and the response that it had to Russia when Ukraine was invaded. It has been a place where Russian money is so fertile that it's often called, the city of London is often called Londongrad. So to the extent that Britain has been lax in its response, it's exited. Brexit was another example of moving away from Europe, moving away from its Euro-Atlantic sort of future, general future. The suspicion is that this was going to happen, and if it was going to respond, the response, the 23 diplomats being expelled is one thing, but there should have been an even larger response.
So do you think that more people should be kicked out of the UK, more Russians, more diplomats?
My suspicion is that there has to be something that hurts a bit more. Something, in terms of soft power, the World Cup is always very, very important. We hear that the royals are not going to be coming to the event. We hear that the ministers are not. My suspicion is that Britain could have said that the audience ought to be aware of going to Russia for the 18 event, perhaps even threaten suggesting to the team not to go to the event. And this is not a military response, but it is a very strong response in the field of soft power. Same thing happens with media. We hear there are rumors that Russia Today may be closed down. That would be a very strong response.
So you mentioned earlier something should be done that hurts a little more. There are rumors that RT may cease to exist, but is that enough, or do you think that it should hurt even more? After all, 2 people are hospitalized, potentially dozens more are exposed to this chemical grade, this weapon. What more should be done? You
have 2 questions, and first, and both are very, very good questions. The first is that something has happened that is very, very troubling, and that is the introduction of Novichok, a nerve gas or a nerve agent that has actually was part of Russia's chemical warfare arsenal. We're talking about someone using something that potentially could have had many casualties instead of the 2 that we had plus the officer. In other words, this is an introduction of a weapon onto someone else's territory.
Mass destruction.
Yeah, a weapon of mass destruction. Very, very good. That's exactly it. So the stage has been set for something very, very different. So the responses have to be in kind. Shutting off RT, there are those that are already complaining that RT would go too far, freedom of speech and so on and so forth. But if you have a hostile act, one that actually has military implication, because a chemical weapon was used. This was developed as a chemical weapon, and a weapon not of an assassin's sort, but a chemical weapon that could be used on a mass scale. We're talking about the introduction of something that's not supposed to be introduced at all at any stage, nuclear, bio, and chemical. We're talking about something that has been introduced. Salisbury was hit. We don't know what the after effects, to this day, we still don't know what the after effects. You see the British military on the streets of a small British town. I mean, that's wild.
I want to make sure that I understand your perspective. Is it your belief, Walter, that the Russians are in fact responsible for this? Right now, they're not claiming responsibility. Do you believe they did this?
Well, ironically, I don't have to be the one quoted. Mizaryan, who ran the Novichok project for the Russians in the 70s and then defected to the United States, understood that this was his little baby that was being used and actually humbly apologized on TV for what he had created. So one doesn't have to turn to me for the question, or to you, to our media. It is actually someone who invented it, who's now saying how awful it was that it was used this way.
We know that the Russians invented it, but whether they actually used it in this particular case is what is up for interpretation. Do you think this goes as far as Putin?
Precisely because it is out of the arsenal. Precisely because this is military grade.
Not cyanide. This is
military grade nerve agent. This is something that was used as a weapon of war. Means that unless Putin admits right before his election that he has no control over his arsenals, he's got to wear this thing. Because if he admits, or if he says he doesn't, then his arsenals are not under his control, and that's another kettle of fish.
You open an interesting box right here. So we know that Putin's going to, well, he's up for re-election. Almost 100% chance that he's going to win re-election at this point. Is he sending a message right now? The UK looks a little weak as it's separating from the European Union. Is it that he smells blood?
Actually, right now, you are literally quoting the Chatham House article that's been written by two very famous characters, James Lowe and James Scher, who state exactly that Britain's weakness, perceived weakness by Putin, is allowing Putin to say, okay, now I can take it one step further. Let's see if I escalate, whether you escalate further or whether I escalate and then can de-escalate. That's his style, and he's using with Britain because he thinks Britain is weak. Yes.
So at this point, the challenge for the UK is not just to stand up against Russia, but it's also to show the world that they are not a weakening power.
Yes, yes. Yes, that's the crux of the matter at this point. Yes.
Can they do it?
Yes, if the response is appropriate. If Russia takes Britain's responses seriously, then we can see a reversal. If it does not, then Britain might have to expect further trouble.
So we know Nikki Haley has spoken, but President Trump has not mentioned this yet. What are we to make of that?
All of it seems troubling, though I must say that President Trump did say that he stands behind Prime Minister May's findings and so on and so forth. One suspects then that one should hear more from the Trump administration, but right now, without Tillerson at the head of State Department, it's actually even difficult for the administration to be able to take a position on this.
So much controversy. Thank you so much, Walter Zaryckyj. It's always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, sir.